So hi everyone, and welcome to another Facebook and Instagram and YouTube live session. And this is our session number 63 that I hold every Sunday evening at 8:30 p.m. Brisbane time. And tonight I will be talking about if you need to be registered to work as an engineer here in Australia. But first, for those that don't know me, my name is Gerson Ida. I'm the founder of www.engineersinaustralia.com, a website to share content of value and useful information to help you in your journey to validate your engineering qualification in Australia. And also, I share other information about engineering stuff like workplace health and safety, environmental management, job recruitment, and some job opportunities as well. But before I start, I would like to know, do you know the difference between being validated as an engineer and being registered as an engineer here in Australia? So if you do, please put in the comments your response so I know if I need to approach this question as well. If you don't, put in the comments saying that no, I don't know what's the difference, and I will explain what's the difference between being validated as an engineer here in Australia and being registered as an engineer here in Australia. So let's get down to the business now, and I'm really happy to be here and share my experience as a registered engineer, registered professional engineer, practicing here in Queensland, which is the only state in Australia that has a comprehensive registration scheme for professional engineers. So, the first question, perhaps it's a quiz. Did you know that the title engineer is not protected in Australia? So probably you didn't know that. So the title engineer is not protected in Australia. And I was reading an article from Engineers Australia, and I was quite surprised with that. And they say that therefore, because the title of engineer is not protected here in Australia, anyone can claim to be an engineer and practice without the necessary competencies, understanding the standards, or even in compliance with the code of ethics. So certainly, if the title is not protected and anyone can be called an engineer themselves, this exposes our profession of engineers, to poor quality engineering, a lack of public trust, and increased general risk, be it financial, safety, or environmental. So most people, they are surprised to learn that engineering profession does not have this technical assurance in place. Different to when you compare to other professions such as medicine, law, accounting, teaching, architecture, etc. So which all of those professions, they require registration either on a state or a national level. And as I mentioned before, Queensland is the only state in Australia that has a full registration scheme in place. But what does it mean to have a full registration in place? It means that if you get caught practicing professional engineering services without being registered or being supervised by a registered engineer, it is an offense, it's a crime, and you can be charged and prosecuted for that. So, which states have some form of registration for engineers? Well, certainly here in Queensland, we've seen a long-standing requirement for registration here in Queensland under the RPEQ, the Registered Professional Engineer of Queensland. And this scheme, the registration scheme, started in 1929. So this year, the Board of Professional Engineers of Queensland, they're celebrating 90 years of registration. So it means that for the last 90 years, the profession of engineers here in Queensland is protected by law. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the registration scheme here in Queensland. Other states, let's say Western Australia. So Western Australia, they have released, Western Australia government of course, they have released a consultation paper proposing changes to their Building Services Registration Act 2011. So, and this consultation is to allow for the registration of building engineers and to introduce a code of conduct for engineers. And it will also require all types of registered practitioners to work within their area of competence. And the categories of engineers they propose to be registered, they include civil engineers, structural engineers, hydraulic engineers, mechanical engineers, geotechnical engineers, and fire safety engineers. So that's for Western Australia. And then in New South Wales, in June 2020, the New South Wales Parliament passed the Design and Building Practitioners Bill. And this new act introduces a requirement for professional engineers to be registered to practice without supervision. It will initially apply to 5 areas of practice: civil, structural, mechanical, electrical, and fire safety engineering. And obviously more areas of practice can be added through regulation later on. And although the registration requirements are contained within building practitioners, they will apply to engineers working in any sector, as long as you are in one of those 5 categories. In New South Wales, they will join Queensland and Victoria, and I'm going to talk about Victoria soon, to now require engineers to have compulsory registration after the New South Wales government passed those laws to reform the state's building sector. Those ones that live in New South Wales, they probably seen some news last year about few issues that they had within the building industry with high rises building, etc. And the new laws, which will initially apply to professional engineers in the civil, structural, electrical, mechanical, and fire safety engineering fields, they are expected to commence on July 1, 2021. So between now and then, there will be some consultation done with the professionals there, and there will be a transition period between 1 July 2021 and then a few more years until the full scheme is implemented. So what does it mean? It means that the outcomes of the legislation mean that it will become an offense for a person to use the title registered professional engineer unless they are registered and have the right qualifications and level of competency. And for those perhaps not used to the word offense, offense means that pretty much it's a crime that you can be prosecuted if you breach that legislation. And then, as I mentioned, sorry. And then, as I mentioned before, YouTube, still online on YouTube. I'm just checking. And then in Victoria, as I mentioned, the Parliament, the Victorian Parliament, also passed the bill that will mean that engineers working through Victoria will need to be registered in order to perform certain types of work. So the Professional Engineers Registration Bill 2019 was passed in late August, and we'll see those performing work in structural, civil, mechanical, electrical, and fire safety engineering, all required to be registered. And they're also going to have a transition period between 1 July and probably a few years. So engineers, they can get registered so they don't really commit an offense. So registrations in Victoria will be awarded by the Building Licensing Authority, and will ensure that all Victorian engineers on the register meet the necessary minimum standards as set by that authority. So while details of competency requirements will be subject to further consultation with industry experts, they will be consulting obviously engineers and lawyers and other professionals there. They are expected to include an accredited 4-year qualification. As you probably know, the Australian qualification for engineers here is a 4-year bachelor degree. At least 5 years experience working as a professional engineer in a relevant field, that's in Victoria, and a requirement to undertake 150 hours of CPD, continuing professional development, over the course of 3 years. So members who are on Engineers Australia Voluntary National Engineering Register, NER, will be deemed to have already met the requirements of the new bill and will therefore not need to be registered. And also, while the scheme currently only covers a selection of the engineering disciplines, those 5 disciplines, there is a scope to add other more in the future. And Russian engineers, certainly, they play a key role in maintaining and improving the standards of buildings. They can work with mechanical and electronic systems and the structural and fire safety issues. Engineers also help to protect the safety and health of people in buildings, promote cost-effective construction, and resolve environmental and energy issues as well. And what about Tasmania? Is there anybody there in Tasmania? So if you are in Tasmania, yeah, put in the comments that you are in Tasmania. But in Tasmania has a limited version of licensing. So what Tasmania does have, they have a scheme for engineer licensing, for fire and safety engineers, for building services engineer, and civil engineers as well. And to be eligible for licensing, you need to have a degree for the relevant engineering class, or be listed on the National Engineer Register, NER, or be a CP-Eng, a Chartered Professional Engineer with Engineers Australia. What about Northern Territory? Any engineer here from Northern Territory? So the Northern Territory also has a limited scheme called Certifying Engineer for 3 categories: the Structural Engineer, for Hydraulic Engineer, and for Mechanical Engineers. If you are not on the NER, the Engineers Australia Voluntary Register, National Engineering Registration, you will need to have 3 years of practical experience, including 12 months practical experience in design and 12 months practical experience in supervision, obviously relevant to the subcategory that you are applying for. And what about South Australia? So South Australia government is working together with industry and peak bodies to implement a registration scheme. Same thing happening with the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory. So if you're part of my Telegram group, I usually put some news. Sometimes the Board of Professional Engineers of Queensland and Engineers Australia, they release some news, and then I usually share those news in my Telegram group about engineering qualification validation in Australia. So if you are not part of that group, I've got already about 700 participants, majority of them engineers. So I'm going to put the link for you to be part of the group in the comments. I just put in Facebook. I'm going to copy now in YouTube. And then if you're watching on Instagram, the link to join my Telegram group is the link on my bio. So you just go there, you can click on the link tree / Gerson Ida. It will open a series of buttons, and then there is one button there that you can join my Telegram group. Also with the new legislation in Victoria, and New South Wales from 1 July 2021. As I said, those states will follow what Queensland is doing for 90 years. So, as I mentioned before, what happens here in Queensland, and to be registered in Queensland, and probably going to follow the same in Victoria and New South Wales. To be registered, you need to pass stage number 2 with Engineers Australia or Professionals Australia. And there are some institutes for particular professions like mining and chemical engineers. They have their own assessing bodies. But it is a prerequisite to have the qualification validated with the stage 1. And this means that in the near future, those engineers that are not registered will have a market disadvantage, as most companies will be hiring registered engineers. So here in Queensland, to be able to be a RPEQ, Registered Professional Engineer of Queensland, you need to be CPEng or RPEng with Professionals Australia. So what's the difference between being validated as an engineer with Engineers Australia and being registered, for example, here in Queensland with the Board of Professional Engineers of Queensland? Well, they are two different things. Being validated means that you have applied with Engineers Australia to get your qualification validated, your bachelor degree. And from one of those 5 or 6 pathways, you ended up getting your overseas qualification validated, and then you are eligible to become a member of Engineers Australia. So that's the membership status. So does it mean that you can work as an engineer here in Australia? Yes, you can, depending on what you do and how you do it. In Queensland, for example, you can work being validated without being registered. There are 2 exceptions to the legislation. One exception is that if you're not registered, you need to be directly supervised by a registered professional engineer of Queensland. So if you're not registered, you can provide professional engineering services, but you have to be directly supervised by RPEQ. The other exception is that if you're not registered, that you can work and provide professional engineering services if you follow a prescriptive engineering method that was written and approved by a registered professional engineer of Queensland. And you don't change anything. The moment that you need to change a little bit, that you need to make some changes and make some adjustments, you are then stepping outside of the prescriptive method. And in that case, to make that call, to make that change, you need to be registered, or the author of that prescriptive method needs to approve the change. Other than those 2 exceptions, here in Queensland, you have to be registered to provide professional engineering services. And what are in professional engineering services? There's a vast list of activities that are considered to be a professional engineering services. So if you go to the Board of Professional Engineers of Queensland website, bpeq.qld.gov.au, you will find the definition of professional engineering services and some examples of that. And as I mentioned before, here in Queensland, if you are providing professional engineering services and if you are not registered, you run the risk, if the board catches you, to be prosecuted by the board, and if convicted, you're liable to pay a fine, and they're heavy fines, and also you run the risk to go to jail as well. So as I mentioned before, the registration is a legislation here in Queensland, and if you breach that legislation, you are committing an offense, a crime. So I hope these tips have been helpful. If you guys have any particular question, put in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer those. We're approaching half an hour, and I would like to thank you guys. And if you're interested to participate in my next free workshop, Engineering Qualification Validation, we'll put the link in the comments. And those ones on Instagram, you can go to my bio, and then I have the link to be registered in the free workshop, Engineering Qualification Validation, in my bio there. And then on Facebook and YouTube, I put in the comments, so you can click on that link and participate. I don't really have a date yet, but perhaps it's going to be probably next month or end of this month. So depending on obviously my time and depending on interest of you guys. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention and participation tonight. If you have any suggestion for a subject to be for next week's live session, please send me an email or put in the comments. I had somebody in my Telegram group that suggested that perhaps I could talk about the opportunities for engineers in different states. So I will probably talk about that next Sunday. I'll have to do a little bit of research because I know the situation here in Queensland and a little bit in New South Wales and Victoria because I've got friends that are working there. So I'll do a little bit of research, and then if I feel that I have enough information, I will cover that in our next live session. All right then, I would like to thank you guys very much, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.